The sleepy coastal town of Crystal Shores, Florida, wasn't accustomed to violent crime. Known for its pristine beaches and quiet neighborhoods, it was the kind of place where everyone knew each other, or so they thought. On an unusually humid morning, Sheriff Rebecca Becky Graves was called to a scene that would shatter the town's illusion of peace. A jogger had stumbled upon a gruesome discovery, a dismembered human arm half buried in the sand, partially exposed by the morning tide. The jogger's frantic 911 call brought Sheriff Graves and her team to the beach within minutes. Standing by the shoreline, Becky Graves adjusted her wide-brimmed hat against the glare of the sun. The sight before her was horrifying. The arm was cleanly severed as if by someone with precision and skill. The victim wore a gold bracelet engraved with the initials HP, a small but significant clue. "Bag it," she said grimly, motioning to the forensic team, "and start combing the area for more remains. This isn't the work of an amateur." Within hours, word spread across Crystal Shores. Locals began to speculate about the identity of the victim, but one name quickly surfaced: Helen Proctor, the 38-year-old wife of Reverend Samuel Proctor, pastor of the town's largest church. Helen had been reported missing 2 days earlier. Samuel Proctor was a charismatic man known for his passionate sermons and community outreach. His wife Helen was equally beloved, often seen organizing charity events and supporting local families. Together, they were the picture-perfect couple, or so it seemed. Sheriff Graves visited the Proctor residence that afternoon. The house stood at the edge of a quiet cul-de-sac, its manicured lawn and white picket fence symbolizing the ideal American life. Reverend Proctor greeted her at the door, his face pale and his hands trembling. "Sheriff Graves," he said, his voice shaky. "Have you found Helen?" Becky hesitated, studying his reaction. "We've found something. I need to ask you a few questions." Inside the Proctor home, the walls were lined with family photos: Samuel, Helen, and their 5 children. Becky couldn't help but notice how perfect they all looked, almost too perfect. "Reverend," she began, "when was the last time you saw your wife?" "2 nights ago," Samuel replied, staring at the floor. "She said she was going to visit a friend, but she never came home. I thought she might have stayed the night. When she didn't return, I called the police. And this friend's name? Lila Thompson," he said. "She lives about 10 minutes from here." Becky made a note but couldn't ignore the nervous energy emanating from him. Something about his demeanor didn't sit right. Did Helen seem upset before she left? Any arguments? Anything unusual? Samuel hesitated, his hands gripping the edge of the table. "We had some disagreements recently, but nothing serious. Just normal married stuff." Before Becky could press further, a child's voice called from upstairs. "Daddy?" Samuel excused himself, leaving Becky to wander the living room. Her eyes landed on a framed family portrait. She stared at the children, all 5 of them, noticing their striking resemblance to Samuel, but also to someone else. By evening, the forensic team confirmed the remains belonged to Helen Proctor. The dismemberment was precise, suggesting the killer had either medical training or experience with butchery. Back at the sheriff's office, Becky reviewed the autopsy report. Alongside the physical injuries, the medical examiner had found something unexpected: DNA traces under Helen's fingernails. It was clear she had fought her attacker, and the DNA didn't match Samuel's. "This just got a lot more complicated," Becky muttered. The next morning, Becky received a call from the lab. The DNA under Helen's nails had matched someone in the federal database: a man named Charles Proctor, Samuel's estranged father. Charles had a criminal history, including assault and battery, and had been living off the grid for years. Becky's head spun. Why would Charles Proctor's DNA be connected to Helen's murder? And why was there an unshakable tension in the Proctor household? She needed answers. She decided to pay Lila Thompson, Helen's supposed friend, a visit. Lila lived in a modest bungalow on the edge of town and greeted Becky with tear-streaked cheeks. "Helen never came to see me," Lila admitted. "I don't know why Samuel told you that." Becky's suspicions deepened. Something wasn't adding up. "Did Helen ever confide in you about her marriage?" Becky asked. Lila hesitated before nodding. "She told me things weren't as perfect as they seemed. Samuel, he was controlling. She said she felt trapped sometimes." "What about Charles Proctor?" Did she ever mention him? Lila's eyes widened. Charles. I didn't think he was still around. Helen never talked about him, but I know Samuel hated his father. They had a falling out years ago. Back at the station, Becky pieced together the timeline. If Helen hadn't gone to Lila's house, where had she gone? And what role did Charles play in all of this? A breakthrough came when forensics retrieved DNA from one of the Proctor children's toothbrushes. Comparing it to Charles Proctor's DNA, they uncovered a sickening truth. Charles was not only Samuel's father, he was also the biological father of all 5 of Samuel and Helen's children. Becky's stomach churned as the implication sank in. Helen must have discovered the truth, and it had cost her life. Samuel's facade of a devoted preacher and family man was crumbling. Becky knew she needed to confront him, but she also knew this case was far from over. As Becky prepared to return to the Proctor home, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was about to uncover something far darker than she had ever imagined. The idyllic town of Crystal Shores was no longer a haven. It was a battleground for secrets, lies, and betrayal. And at the center of it all stood Samuel Proctor, a man whose perfect life was built on a foundation of unspeakable sins. Sheriff Becky Graves arrived at the Proctor residence in the early evening. The sun was dipping below the horizon, casting long shadows over the quiet cul-de-sac. There was an eerie stillness in the air as she stepped out of her cruiser. She had come prepared this time, armed with the chilling revelations about Charles Proctor and the twisted truth behind the Proctor children. Becky knocked on the door, her hands steady but her mind racing. Samuel answered, his expression weary. "Sheriff," he greeted, his voice tight. "Have you found anything new about Helen?" Becky looked him straight in the eye. "We need to talk, Reverend, and this time I need complete honesty." Becky followed Samuel into the living room, where the faint hum of a ceiling fan filled the silence. The walls that once seemed adorned with innocent family memories now felt like a gallery of lies. Becky remained standing, her posture commanding. "Reverend Proctor, I'll be blunt. We've confirmed that the remains we found belong to your wife, Helen." Samuel flinched but said nothing, his hands clasped tightly together. "We also ran some DNA tests," Becky continued, her voice sharper now. "The DNA we found under Helen's fingernails belonged to your father, Charles Proctor." Samuel's eyes widened in shock. He stammered, "That's impossible. My father's been out of my life for years. I haven't seen him since—" "Since when, Reverend?" Becky interrupted, her tone demanding. Samuel hesitated, his gaze darting around the room as if searching for an escape. Finally, he sighed and sank into an armchair. "Since I found out what kind of man he really was." Samuel recounted his childhood in a small rural town in northern Florida. His father, Charles, had been a charismatic but cruel man, prone to violent outbursts and secretive behavior. Samuel described how his father's unpredictable temper often turned their home into a battlefield. "When I was 18, I left home and never looked back," Samuel said. "I couldn't be around him anymore. I built my life from scratch, away from his shadow." "But he came back into your life, didn't he?" Becky pressed. Samuel's face darkened. "About a year ago, he showed up unannounced, said he was dying and wanted to make amends. I didn't believe him, but Helen, she thought we should give him a chance. She said it was the Christian thing to do." Becky scribbled notes, her instincts telling her there was more to the story. "And what happened after that?" "He stayed with us for a few months," Samuel admitted. "But I kicked him out when I realized he hadn't changed. He was still manipulative, still dangerous. I told him never to come back." Becky leaned forward, her eyes narrowing. "Did Helen ever have a relationship with your father?" Samuel's face turned pale and his jaw tightened. "What are you implying?" "I'm not implying anything, Reverend," Becky said, her voice cold. "I'm telling you that DNA tests have confirmed Charles Proctor is the biological father of all 5 of your children." The words hung in the air like a thunderclap. Samuel stared at her, his expression a mixture of shock, anger, and disbelief. "That's not possible," Samuel whispered, shaking his head. "You're lying. There's no way." "I wish I were," Becky said. "But the evidence doesn't lie. Either your wife had a long-term relationship with your father, or something even darker was going on in your home." Samuel shot to his feet, his face contorted with rage. Don't you dare speak about my wife like that. She would never. Then explain the DNA, Reverend, Becky snapped, her voice cutting through his outburst. Explain why Helen's body was found dismembered and why she fought your father before she died. Because right now, the only thing that makes sense is that she found out the truth and someone killed her to keep her quiet. Samuel collapsed back into the chair, burying his face in his hands. I don't know, he murmured. I don't know what to believe anymore. Becky left the Proctor residence that night with more questions than answers. Samuel's reaction seemed genuine, but there was still a nagging suspicion in her mind. If Samuel wasn't involved in Helen's murder, then who was? Back at the station, Becky reviewed the evidence again. The DNA confirmed Charles Proctor's connection to both the victim and the children. But there was one glaring inconsistency. Charles's criminal record showed no history of sexual crimes. While he was certainly violent, there was nothing to suggest he was capable of fathering his son's children. Or was there? She decided to dig deeper into Charles's past, searching for any clues that might explain the twisted family dynamic. What she found sent chills down her spine. Charles Proctor had been arrested in the 1980s for a series of crimes, including assault and unlawful imprisonment. One police report described a disturbing incident involving a young woman who claimed Charles had drugged and assaulted her. The charges were dropped due to lack of evidence, but the details painted a grim picture. Becky realized she needed to locate Charles, who had seemingly vanished after being kicked out of the Proctor home. If he was still alive, he was the key to unraveling this case. The next morning, Becky received a tip from a local motel manager. A man matching Charles Proctor's description had checked in under a fake name 2 weeks earlier. The manager reported hearing loud arguments coming from the room, followed by the man leaving in a hurry around the time Helen went missing. Becky and her team rushed to the motel. Inside the dingy room, they found a chaotic scene. Empty liquor bottles, torn photographs of the Proctor family, and a blood-stained knife. Get this to forensic, Becky ordered, her heart pounding. As she scanned the room, her eyes landed on a crumpled letter shoved into the trash. Unfolding it carefully, she read the scrawled handwriting. They all needed to pay, especially her. She ruined everything. The note was unsigned, but Becky knew who had written it. Charles Proctor had left a trail of destruction in his wake, and now it was up to Becky to stop him before anyone else paid the price. Sheriff Becky Graves knew the case had reached a boiling point. Charles Proctor had become the prime suspect in Helen's murder, and his trail was growing colder with each passing hour. The blood-stained knife found in his motel room and the ominous letter hinted at a man on the edge. Becky called an emergency meeting at the station. The investigation team gathered in the conference room, their faces tense. Maps of Florida were pinned to the walls, marked with locations where Charles might flee. All right, listen up, Becky began, her tone sharp. Charles Proctor is dangerous and desperate. He knows we're onto him, and he'll do whatever it takes to stay hidden. We need to move fast. The first lead came from the motel manager, who mentioned seeing Charles arguing with someone before he left. It was a younger man, the manager said over the phone. Looked like he wanted nothing to do with Charles. Drove off in a beat-up pickup. Becky immediately thought of Samuel. She called him, her voice firm. Reverend Proctor, did you or anyone from your family have contact with your father after he left your home? No, Samuel said quickly, but there was hesitation in his voice. Why? Did something happen? We found evidence in his motel room linking him to Helen's murder. If you know anything, now's the time to tell me. There was a long pause before Samuel finally admitted. He came to see me a week ago. Said he wanted to talk, but I told him to leave. I didn't want anything to do with him. What did he say? Becky pressed. He said he knew something about Helen, something I wouldn't like. But I didn't listen. I told him I never wanted to see him again. Becky clenched her jaw. Samuel's refusal to engage might have pushed Charles further into his spiral, but she couldn't blame him for wanting to protect himself. Becky returned to the station, reviewing the evidence again with her team. The motel room had provided several clues. The blood-stained knife was sent to forensics, confirming it matched Helen's DNA. The torn photographs suggested a deep obsession with the Proctor family, particularly Helen. The cryptic letter pointed to premeditation, though its vagueness left much to interpretation. We need to find where he's hiding, Becky said. Check his credit card records, gas station cameras, any surveillance footage we can find. Hours later, a breakthrough came. Charles's credit card had been used at a gas station near the Everglades. The footage showed him filling up his truck, his movements hurried. Becky grabbed her keys. The Everglades were a labyrinth of murky waters and dense foliage, the perfect hiding spot for someone on the run. Becky coordinated with local law enforcement, setting up checkpoints and deploying search teams. As they combed through the swamp, Becky's radio crackled. "Sheriff, we found his truck," an officer reported, "abandoned on a dirt road about 2 miles in." Becky arrived at the scene, the humid air thick with the smell of decay. The truck's doors were open, and inside they found a collection of supplies, canned food, a map of the Everglades, and a shotgun. "He's close," Becky muttered, her hand instinctively resting on her holstered weapon. The search continued into the night. Flashlights cut through the darkness as officers waded through the swamp, the air filled with the buzz of insects. Around midnight, Becky's team stumbled upon a makeshift campsite. A fire still smoldered, and a figure sat hunched over on a fallen log. "Charles Proctor," Becky called out, her voice commanding. "Stand up and put your hands where I can see them." The figure didn't move at first. Then slowly Charles stood, his face illuminated by the flickering firelight. He looked gaunt and unhinged, his eyes wild. "You don't understand," he said, his voice shaking. "She betrayed me. She betrayed us all. Drop any weapons and step away from the fire," Becky ordered, her gun drawn. Charles raised his hands, but there was a glint of something metallic in his right hand. A knife. "She deserved it," he screamed, his voice echoing through the swamp. "She lied to everyone, to him, to me. Charles, put the knife down," Becky shouted, her heart pounding. Instead, Charles lunged forward, the knife flashing in the firelight. Becky fired, the sound of the gunshot reverberating through the swamp. Charles fell to the ground, the knife slipping from his hand. Officers rushed to secure him, checking for a pulse. He was alive but gravely injured. As paramedics arrived to stabilize him, Charles muttered incoherently, his words slurred. Becky leaned in close, determined to get answers. "She found out," Charles whispered, blood staining his lips. "About the kids, about me. She was going to tell him everything." "Tell who?" Becky demanded. "Samuel?" Charles nodded weakly. "She said it wasn't right. Said I was a monster. But I loved her. I loved them all." His words trailed off as the paramedics loaded him onto a stretcher. Becky watched as they disappeared into the darkness, her mind racing. Back at the station, Becky pieced together what she had learned. Helen had discovered the truth about Charles's relationship with her children and confronted him. In his twisted mind, he had believed he could silence her and maintain control over the family he had manipulated for years. Charles's arrest brought some closure, but Becky knew the Proctor family would never be the same. The scars of his actions ran too deep. As she filed her final report, Becky couldn't shake the haunting image of the Proctor home, a house of faith and family, shattered by secrets and lies. The arrest of Charles Proctor left the Proctor family and the entire Florida community reeling. Samuel Proctor, the once respected preacher, was left with the devastating task of reconciling the brutal murder of his wife, Helen, with the arrest of his estranged father. But it wasn't just grief that weighed on him. It was the mystery Charles had hinted at during his arrest. Becky Graves couldn't let go of Charles's final words. "She found out about the kids. About me." The statement raised chilling questions, and she was determined to uncover the full truth. Becky knew the key to unraveling Charles's cryptic confession lay with the Proctor children. Samuel and Helen had 5 children, ranging from ages 3 to 14. To the outside world, they were the perfect family, obedient, kind, and deeply religious. After discussing the situation with Samuel, Becky explained the need for DNA testing. "I know this is invasive," she said gently, "but if there's any chance Charles was telling the truth, we need to know." Samuel hesitated. "What are you saying, Sheriff? That my father—" His voice faltered, unable to finish the thought. Becky nodded grimly. "It's a possibility we have to consider. If Charles is the biological father of any of your children, it could explain his obsession with your family and Helen." Samuel reluctantly agreed, and samples were taken from him, Charles, and the children. The DNA results would take a few days to process, leaving the family and investigators in agonizing suspense. In the meantime, Becky turned her attention to Helen's personal belongings, hoping to find clues to what she had discovered. Among her things, Becky found a small leather-bound journal hidden in a drawer of the Proctor home. The entries painted a picture of a woman tormented by doubt and fear. Helen had been a devoted wife and mother, but in recent months her faith in Samuel and their family had begun to crack. One entry caught Becky's attention. "I found something today. Something I can't unsee. How could he do this? How could he betray us this way? I don't know how to confront him. I'm afraid of what he might do." Another entry, written just days before her murder, read, "The children deserve to know the truth, no matter how much it hurts. I can't let this secret fester any longer. Samuel will hate me for it, but it's the right thing to do. God give me strength." Becky stared at the words, her chest tightening. Helen had known the truth, and it had cost her life. 3 days later, the results from the lab arrived. Becky sat in her office, the sealed envelope trembling in her hands. She tore it open and read the report. Her stomach churned. 3 of the 5 Proctor children were biologically fathered by Charles, not Samuel. The implications were staggering. Not only had Charles fathered these children, but he had done so while Helen was married to Samuel. Becky suspected Helen had only recently discovered this horrifying truth, likely through a paternity test of her own. Becky called Samuel to the station, her voice steady but solemn. When he arrived, she broke the news as gently as she could. "3 of your children, they aren't yours biologically," she said. "They're Charles's." Samuel's face went pale, his eyes wide with disbelief. "No," he whispered. "That's not possible. Helen would never, she couldn't." "I'm so sorry, Reverend," Becky said, her heart aching for the broken man before her. "I believe Helen didn't know until recently. She must have found out through a test. And when she confronted Charles, Samuel buried his face in his hands, his shoulders shaking with sobs. "He destroyed everything," he choked out. "My family, my faith, my Helen." As the investigation continued, Becky uncovered more details about Charles's relationship with Helen. Interviews with neighbors and members of the congregation revealed a troubling pattern. Charles had been a frequent visitor to the Proctor home during the early years of Samuel and Helen's marriage. He often helped with repairs or babysat the children, while Samuel was busy with church duties. One neighbor, an elderly woman named Mrs. Lopez, recalled seeing Charles and Helen together late at night. "I thought it was strange," she said. "They'd be talking in the backyard, real close, like they didn't want anyone to hear." Becky also found receipts and photographs suggesting Charles had secretly supported the family financially, paying for school tuition and other expenses. It became clear that Charles had manipulated Helen over the years, preying on her vulnerabilities and ultimately fathering her children without Samuel's knowledge. Piecing together the timeline, Becky theorized that Helen had confronted Charles about the DNA results shortly before her murder. She likely demanded that he leave the family alone and threatened to tell Samuel everything. For Charles, who had spent years controlling the family from the shadows, this was unacceptable. He had killed Helen to silence her and protect his twisted version of their family. Samuel struggled to process the revelations. His grief for Helen was now tangled with anger and betrayal. He couldn't bear to look at his children, knowing they were the product of his father's deception. But despite his pain, Samuel knew he had to protect them. They were innocent in all of this, and he resolved to shield them from the dark truth of their origins. "I'll tell them when they're older," he told Becky. "For now, they don't need to know. They've lost their mother. I won't take anything else from them." Becky nodded, respecting his decision. "You're a good man, Reverend," she said. "This isn't your fault." Samuel shook his head, tears streaming down his face. "No, but it's my burden to bear." With Charles in custody and the DNA evidence solidifying his motives, the case was close to being closed. But for Becky, the emotional weight of the investigation lingered. She couldn't stop thinking about Helen's bravery in uncovering the truth and the tragic cost of her discovery. In the end, Helen's fight for her family had exposed the darkness, lurking beneath the surface of their seemingly perfect lives. As Becky filed the final report for the day, she glanced at the photograph of Helen and her children on her desk. "Rest easy," she murmured. "We'll make sure he pays for what he's done." The arrest of Charles Proctor sent shockwaves through the community, but for Samuel Proctor, it shattered his entire world. The once revered preacher, whose sermons inspired hope and unity, found himself at the center of a scandal so dark it threatened to consume him. The weight of betrayal was almost too much to bear, and Samuel began to question everything he once held sacred. The revelation of Charles's crimes, combined with the shocking DNA evidence, tore through the congregation like a wildfire. Gossip spread quickly, and the once packed pews of Samuel's church now sat nearly empty on Sunday mornings. "Did you hear? 3 of his kids aren't even his," one woman whispered at the local diner. "I heard his father was living a double life," another added. "How does someone hide something like that for years?" The scandal painted Samuel as a man who couldn't even protect his own family, let alone guide a congregation. Though he was innocent of any wrongdoing, the whispers and sideways glances followed him everywhere he went. Becky Graves noticed the change in Samuel. The confident preacher she had met during the initial investigation now looked like a broken man. He stopped shaving, his clothes hung loosely on his frame, and his once booming voice had turned to a near whisper. "Are you holding up, Reverend?" Becky asked one afternoon when she visited his home to deliver updates on the case. Samuel gave a weak smile. "I'm trying, Sheriff, but it feels like my entire life has been a lie. My father, my wife, even my faith. I don't know what to believe anymore." Becky placed a hand on his shoulder. "You're stronger than you think, Samuel. Your kids need you now more than ever. Don't let Charles take any more from you." While Samuel grappled with his own emotions, his children were struggling in their own ways. The older kids had overheard enough conversations to piece together parts of the truth. They knew their mother was dead, their grandfather was in jail, and their father was barely holding on. One evening, Samuel's eldest son, Michael, confronted him. "Dad, is it true? About Grandpa? About us?" Samuel froze, unsure how to respond. He looked into his son's tear-filled eyes and saw the pain and confusion mirrored in his own heart. "Michael, listen to me," Samuel said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "None of this is your fault. You're my son, no matter what any DNA test says. I love you, and that will never change." Michael nodded, but the weight of the truth lingered. The other children, too young to understand the full scope of the situation, clung to Samuel for comfort. But even their innocent questions, "When is Mommy coming back?" cut him to the core. Meanwhile, in the county jail, Charles Proctor was proving to be an enigma. At first, he refused to speak to anyone, his demeanor cold and unyielding. But after weeks of silence, he requested to speak with Becky Graves. When Becky arrived at the jail, she found Charles sitting at a table, his hands cuffed in front of him. He looked older than his 65 years, his once imposing figure now frail and hunched. "You wanted to see me, Charles?" Becky asked, taking a seat across from him. Charles smirked. "I figured it's time I tell my side of the story." Becky pulled out a recorder and set it on the table. "Go ahead." Charles leaned back in his chair, his expression one of twisted pride. "You think you've got it all figured out, don't you? Helen was going to ruin everything. She wanted to tell Samuel the truth about the kids, about us. She couldn't keep her mouth shut, so I had to shut it for her." Becky's stomach turned at his cold admission. "Why, Charles? Why did you do it? Why did you destroy their lives?" Charles chuckled darkly. "Because I could. Samuel was always the golden boy, the perfect son, but he was weak, blind to what was happening right under his nose. Helen was mine before she was ever his. She came to me for comfort, for guidance, and I gave her everything. Those kids, they're my legacy." Becky felt a surge of anger, but forced herself to stay calm. "Your legacy? You've left nothing but pain and destruction in your wake." Charles leaned forward, his eyes gleaming with malice. "Pain is temporary, Sheriff. My bloodline will carry on. That's all that matters." Charles's confession solidified the case against him, but it also gave Becky a renewed sense of purpose. She was determined to ensure he paid for his crimes, not just for Helen's murder, but for the decades of manipulation and abuse he had inflicted on the Proctor family. She presented the evidence to the district attorney, who assured her that Charles would face the maximum penalty. "We'll make sure he never sees the light of day again," the DA promised. For Samuel, the confession was a bittersweet vindication. He had suspected his father's darkness for years, but never imagined the extent of his cruelty. One Sunday, Samuel stood before his diminished congregation and delivered a heartfelt sermon. "We are all broken in some way," he began, "but it is in our brokenness that we find strength. My family has been torn apart, but I will not let evil have the final word. I will fight for my children, for my faith, and for the memory of my wife." The congregation listened in silence. Many moved to tears. It was a turning point for Samuel, a moment of reclaiming his power and purpose. Though Charles's confession closed one chapter of the case, Becky knew there was still work to be done. She continued to interview friends, neighbors, and church members, piecing together the Proctor family's history. She learned of Helen's quiet resilience, her love for her children, and her determination to protect them from the truth until she could no longer hide it. Becky also uncovered evidence of Charles's financial manipulation, including forged documents and secret bank accounts. It was clear he had not only exploited Helen, but also used his position of trust to control Samuel and the family for years. As Becky compiled her final report, she couldn't help but feel a sense of satisfaction. Justice had been served, but more importantly, the truth had been revealed. In the months that followed, the Proctor family began to heal. Samuel stepped down from his role as preacher to focus on his children, who started therapy to process the trauma they had endured. Becky remained in touch with the family, offering support whenever she could. She admired Samuel's strength and resilience, knowing it took immense courage to rebuild a life shattered by betrayal. One evening, as the sun set over the small Florida town, Samuel sat with his children on the porch, watching them laugh and play. For the first time in what felt like forever, he felt a glimmer of hope. "No matter what happens," he whispered, "we'll get through this together." The trial of Charles Proctor became the focal point of the small Florida town. The courthouse overflowed with reporters, curious residents, and church members seeking closure. It wasn't just about Helen's murder anymore. It was about exposing decades of manipulation, betrayal, and lies orchestrated by a man who had hidden behind the mask of righteousness. Sheriff Becky Graves worked tirelessly with the district attorney, compiling a rock-solid case against Charles. Every piece of evidence was meticulously cataloged: the DNA results, the financial forgeries, and most damning of all, Charles's chilling confession. Becky's role as lead investigator required her to testify at trial, which she knew would be grueling. "Are you ready for this?" the DA asked her during a late-night meeting. Becky nodded. "I'm ready. This isn't just about Helen. It's about giving Samuel and those kids the justice they deserve." Samuel, too, was preparing for his moment in court. He had been called to testify about his father's behavior and his tumultuous marriage to Helen. Though the idea of recounting his pain in front of a courtroom full of strangers terrified him, Samuel knew it was necessary. "I'll tell the truth," he told Becky, "for Helen and for my kids." The trial started with the prosecution's opening statement, a compelling narrative that painted Charles as a manipulative predator who had destroyed his own family for personal gain. Charles Proctor used his position as a father, preacher, and community leader to control and exploit those closest to him. The DA began. "This is a case of betrayal on the deepest level, culminating in the brutal murder of Helen Proctor." The defense, in contrast, attempted to frame Charles as a frail old man, misguided but not malicious. "He is not the monster the prosecution claims," the defense attorney argued. "This is a case of a family torn apart by secrets, but there's no proof Charles intended for things to end this way." The jury sat in tense silence, their faces betraying no emotion as they listened to both sides. Becky was the first major witness to take the stand. She recounted the grisly discovery of Helen's dismembered body, the DNA results revealing the shocking truth about the children's paternity, and Charles's chilling confession. Charles Proctor admitted to killing Helen Proctor because she threatened to expose his secrets, Becky testified. He showed no remorse. To him, it was about maintaining control over his family and his reputation. The courtroom was silent as Becky described the crime scene in vivid detail. A few jurors shifted uncomfortably in their seats, while others stared intently at Charles, whose expression remained cold and detached. Samuel's testimony was equally powerful. He spoke of his father's overbearing presence, his strained marriage to Helen, and the devastating moment he learned the truth about his children's paternity. "I loved my wife," Samuel said, his voice trembling, "and I thought I knew my father. But the truth is, he was manipulating us all from the beginning. Helen wanted to protect our family, and she paid for it with her life." Perhaps the most emotional moment of the trial came when Michael, Samuel's eldest son, took the stand. Though only 14, he displayed remarkable composure as he recounted the day his mother disappeared and the weeks of fear and confusion that followed. "I don't understand why Grandpa did what he did," Michael said, his voice barely above a whisper. "But I know my mom didn't deserve this. She loved us, and she always tried to keep us safe." Michael's testimony brought many in the courtroom to tears, including several jurors. It was a poignant reminder of the human cost of Charles's actions. As the prosecution built a compelling case, the defense struggled to poke holes in their narrative. They attempted to argue that Charles's confession had been coerced, but Becky's meticulous records and recordings of the interrogation left no room for doubt. They also tried to paint Helen as unstable, suggesting her threats to expose the family's secrets were irrational. But this tactic backfired, as it only served to highlight Charles's cruelty and manipulation. The prosecution's closing argument was a masterclass in storytelling and persuasion. "Charles Proctor is not a victim," the DA declared. "He is a predator who used his position of trust to exploit and destroy his own family. He murdered Helen Proctor in cold blood to protect his lies, and he must be held accountable." The defense's closing argument was less impactful, focusing on Charles's age and frailty as mitigating factors. But it was clear the jury was not swayed. After 2 days of deliberation, the jury reached a verdict. The courtroom was packed as the foreman stood to deliver the decision. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Charles Proctor, guilty of first-degree murder." A collective gasp rippled through the room, followed by quiet sobs from Helen's friends and family. Samuel closed his eyes, a mix of relief and sorrow washing over him. Charles was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. For Samuel and his children, it was a bittersweet victory. They had achieved justice for Helen, but the scars left by Charles's betrayal would take years to heal. Becky, reflecting on the case, felt a sense of closure. "It's not just about putting a criminal behind bars," she told a colleague. "It's about giving a family the chance to rebuild." In the months following the trial, the Proctor family began to find their footing again. Samuel returned to his role as a father first and foremost, stepping away from the church to focus on his children. The congregation, inspired by Samuel's resilience, rallied around him and his family. Slowly but surely, the wounds began to heal. As for Becky Graves, the case solidified her reputation as one of the best investigators in the state. But for her, it wasn't about the accolades. It was about the people she had helped along the way. The Proctor family case had shaken the quiet Florida town to its core. And while Charles Proctor sat in a prison cell for the rest of his life, the ripples of his actions continued to echo. For Samuel, his children, and the community, the healing process was a slow and painful journey. Samuel moved his family out of the house where the horrors unfolded. Too many memories lingered in the walls, and staying there felt unbearable. He rented a modest home in a quieter neighborhood, prioritizing stability for his children. Every morning, Samuel woke up early to make breakfast and see his kids off to school. The once vibrant man had grown quieter, more introspective, but he refused to let his father's betrayal define his family's future. "I need to focus on them now," Samuel said to Becky during one of her visits. "Helen would have wanted me to give them the best life I can." Of all the children, Michael, the eldest, carried the heaviest burden. At only 14, he had witnessed the worst of the family's tragedy, and it showed in his quiet demeanor and distant gaze. One evening, Samuel found him sitting on the porch, staring into the distance. "Michael, you okay?" Samuel asked gently. Michael shrugged. I don't get it, Dad. How could Grandpa do that? How could he hurt Mom like that?" Samuel sat beside him, placing a comforting hand on his shoulder. "Sometimes people hide parts of themselves so well that even those closest to them don't see it. Your mom saw it, though. She fought to protect us, Michael. Never forget that. Tears welled up in Michael's eyes, and for the first time since the trial, he allowed himself to cry in his father's arms. For Sheriff Becky Graves, the Proctor case became a defining moment in her career. It wasn't just the complexity of the investigation that left an impression, but the emotional toll it took on everyone involved. Sitting in her office one late evening, Becky flipped through the case file one last time. She saw Helen's photos, the DNA evidence, in Charles's confession. Each piece a reminder of the darkness humanity was capable of. This is why we do what we do, she murmured to herself. To give victims like Helen a voice. The town's church, once a thriving congregation under Charles Proctor's leadership, underwent a transformation. Samuel handed over leadership to a younger preacher, one untainted by scandal. The new pastor focused on rebuilding trust and guiding the congregation toward healing. Community members held candlelight vigils for Helen, honoring her memory as a devoted mother and wife who stood up for her family. The vigils became an annual tradition, a reminder of the importance of vigilance and compassion in the face of adversity. In prison, Charles Proctor faded into obscurity. The man who once commanded respect and admiration was now just another inmate, shunned even by fellow prisoners for the nature of his crimes. Becky received occasional updates from the prison warden. "He's still alive, but barely," the warden told her during one phone call. "It's like the weight of what he's done is finally crushing him." Though Becky felt no sympathy for Charles, she couldn't help but feel a sense of finality. The man who had caused so much pain was finally facing the consequences of his actions, alone and forgotten. 2 years after the trial, Samuel and his children took a trip to a quiet beach, a place Helen had always loved. The children laughed as they played in the waves, their joy a stark contrast to the sorrow that had once consumed the family. As the sun set, Samuel stood at the shoreline, holding a photo of Helen. He whispered a quiet promise to her. "I'll keep them safe. I'll make sure they remember the love you gave us." For Becky Graves, the Proctor case reinforced her commitment to justice. She began mentoring young detectives, sharing her experiences and teaching them the importance of compassion and thoroughness in their work. "It's not just about solving the crime," she told her team one day. "It's about understanding the people involved and doing right by them." The scars left by Charles Proctor's actions would never fully heal, but the Proctor family and their community found ways to move forward. They learned to honor Helen's memory by living lives filled with love, resilience, and hope. As for Becky, she kept a framed photo of Helen on her desk, a reminder of the case that had changed her life forever. Whenever she faced a tough day on the job, she looked at that photo and remembered why she had chosen this path. "Justice isn't always clean or easy," she often said, "but it's worth fighting for." The candlelight vigils for Helen continued to grow, drawing people from neighboring towns who had heard her story. Her legacy became a symbol of courage and the unbreakable bond of family. Though life would never be the same for those left behind, they found solace in each other and in the knowledge that justice had been served.